You're listening to episode 210 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Professor Jeff Wilson joins us to speak about his book, Mindful America, The Mutual Transformation of Buddhist Meditation and American Culture. Chances are, if you listen to this podcast, you've got an inkling of the relationship between traditional Buddhism, secular Buddhism, and the contemporary mindfulness movement. However you think or feel about this relationship, there is one. And as our guest today shares with us, it's not a one-sided affair. Jeff Wilson is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and East Asian Studies for Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. He has written several books and numerous articles about the interaction of Buddhism and various aspects of North American culture, and published pioneering research in the history of same-sex wedding ceremonies. Jeff teaches courses on religion on North America, East Asian religion, and theory and method in religious studies at the University of Waterloo. He is active in the American Academy of Religion and does media appearances and radio interviews to provide an informed perspective on issues of religion in contemporary society. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice pumpkin spice latte. Our guest today is Professor Jeff Wilson. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you very much.
So today we're going to talk about your book, Mindful America, The Mutual Transformation of Buddhist Meditation and American Culture. But before we get into that, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your background with Buddhism and meditation and your current work.
Sure. Well, it's hard to find ultimate origins for anything. And that is true as well in my own biography in relationship to Buddhism. But if we had to have a starting point, probably a good one would be while I was at college, I had the opportunity to do Buddhist studies, academic Buddhist studies, with quite a good professor, Griffith Folk. So I had an interest that was stimulated by him, especially in the academic questions around the study of Buddhism in the academy. And after I graduated from college, I moved to New York City and noticed that there was quite a diversity of Buddhist groups there and meditation groups and so on, many of which I attended out of interest. And I happened to take a job at Tricycle magazine. First, I was the guy answering the door and the phone and all that sort of stuff. And I gradually moved up the ladder into editorial and served on the editorial staff there for a while. And after I moved away from New York City, I happened to fall in with Thomas Tweed, who's a great scholar of Buddhism in North America. He was living in Chapel Hill, teaching there at the same time that I was living there. So I ended up going to graduate school and pursuing the sort of questions that had arisen for me around the idea of Buddhist adaptation to American culture and in American culture. In many ways, this goes back to my work with Griff Folk. The great question of Buddhist studies has been how Buddhism and Indian religion became a Chinese religion over the centuries as it sort of shifted in its eastward development there. So I thought that was very interesting. A lot of Griff's work was involved in that. He was a specialist on medieval Chinese Chan and so on. And I found that quite interesting. But at the same time, there were sort of many questions we would never be able to satisfactorily answer about how it became successfully a Chinese religion, because we had a total lack of anthropologists on the ground back in the day investigating this for us as it was becoming Chinese. There's sort of an oversight there, I suppose. So I thought to myself, living in New York City originally, well, hey, I'm actually living through the same sort of cultural moment where it goes from being, say, a Chinese or a Japanese or a Burmese religion to now being, in this case, a Western, an American religion as well, potentially. So I have the opportunity to be that anthropologist that I wish had been there back in the day to describe and document what was going on. So why don't I pursue this opportunity? So this has led into many of the questions that I have as a scholar to try to trace and document these changes over time. I think perhaps you're also trying to ask about my practitioner background as well. Certainly, there is that as well. I guess I should note that that sort of follows in the wake of the academic engagement. I've, in some ways, been involved with a great many different Buddhist groups of many different types because I've been fieldwork oriented. And so I've visited with these groups, sat with them, meditated, chanted, done all sorts of things. So I have lots of experience on site in many different lineages. That said, my primary personal affiliation is with Jodo Shinshu, Japanese Pure Land Buddhism. I have ordination in that lineage, and that's where I tend to locate myself, not directly involved, therefore, in the mindfulness movement, which I pursued as a topic because it fits my research interest, not necessarily because I had burning questions as a mindfulness practitioner.
So, Jeff, in your scholarly work and with this wide expanse of experience with different areas, different kinds of tradition, different kinds of Buddhism with different peoples, were there any interesting things that stood out for you about commonalities or interesting divergences of views in Buddhism?
Well, if you're talking about Buddhisms in the United States specifically, or North America in general, since I live in Canada these days, there's quite a lot of diversity that I see here amongst all the different groups. In fact, one of the problems is that we've developed various typologies in the academy to try to explain to ourselves and to others what it is we think we see going on in terms of general trends and so on. And these typologies seem to make sense. And then very quickly, they become ever more complicated as exceptions or things that were left out or totally different things that were going on come into our observation as well. And all the typologies begin to fall apart. So I think the reason for that is that this Buddhism in North America is, while still very much a minority set of religions, is at the same time extremely diverse, more diverse than I think hardly anyone gives a credit for. Most people have a limited set of experiences with this type of Buddhism or that type of Buddhism or this form of meditation or whatever it may be. And they tend to imagine that whatever it is that they've personally intersected with is somehow representative of larger general trends or even is representative of some sort of dominant paradigm in some way. What I found is that things are so diverse and so different across many different organizations and types of practice and so on, that it's very hard to say anything at all which is going to be comprehensively true for all the different types of Buddhists and perhaps we should say sort of fellow travelers as well, since Buddhism is not a label that everyone owns, and yet many people might still be grouped into these sort of communities in some way. So it's very hard to say anything that's comprehensively true. That doesn't stop us from trying to. After all, that's how we make our living, right? But nonetheless, it's tremendously diverse.
Yeah, that's one of the things we frequently hear on postings on our Facebook page, for example, is people will weigh in and say, well, Buddhism is this. It'll be things like, Buddhism is not a religion, or others will say quite the opposite. And it's from, I think, what you're indicating here, Jeff, is that there is that perspective of our own personal experience. And we sometimes forget in a perfectly innocent, normal human way that There are lots and lots of other people practicing this that may have a very different view that's still equally valid.
That's right. Well, there's really just such a range of different opinions. And honestly, there's been quite a range of opinions within Asian history of Buddhism as well. But only certain perspectives typically are presented to people, especially in, say, English language translation. So we are very much absorbing just sort of the tip of the iceberg, even with that diversity I'm talking about here. So no matter what perspective someone is advocating, say, Buddhism is a religion. Buddhism's not a religion. It's a philosophy. It's a way of life, and so on. All these different things. You can find some precedent for it in some aspect of the Asian tradition. And you can find some precedent for exactly the opposite perspective, whatever your perspective may be. It's very hard to pin down. And this is what we would expect from an approximately 2,500-year-old, very diverse tradition in so many different cultures, one which has not experienced an excessive degree of centralization. And so, here we go. We've got a great big mess called Buddhism. And for me, that makes it quite a rich research topic.
And a lot of fun because of the diversity involved, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is my third, academic book, and I feel like I've hardly gotten started.
So tell us a little bit about the book itself. What prompted you to write Mindful America?
Well, the way I see it is that it's really just a further, evolution of that driving question that I have. What is going on in the meeting of two different cultural spheres, broadly speaking, Asian Buddhism and North American, mostly Christian, but with a sort of a secular public sphere these days. So this is an encounter just as strange and interesting and different as the encounter of Indian and Chinese or Japanese culture back in the day. We have a tendency to talk broadly about Eastern religions or Asian religion or this sort of thing. It may look that way to us from this standpoint in space and time, but believe me, these are two cultures that originally had not a lot of commonalities. And yet we saw that Buddhism successfully became a very indelibly Chinese religion without stopping also being Indian and India and so forth, right? So what's going on here? I'm very curious about this. My first book examined a particular ritual coming from Japan and its usage in different forms and transformation by various different communities, Buddhist and non-Buddhist. In my second book, I sort of burrowed into this idea of American Buddhism to see if different things were going on in different places within the United States in terms of adaptation, because people had different environments in the US to adapt to. For example, Buddhism in the South is not in the same cultural environmental situation that, say, Buddhism in the San Francisco Bay Area is in. And then to me, mindfulness is a natural topic to move on into, because this mindfulness movement, I believe, is most likely the largest impact which Buddhism is having on North American culture today. So it's the big topic, and yet it's something that we had not a single scholarly, single authored research project on. So I wanted to tackle this and see what was going on in this, and especially figure out if there were processes that go on in the general adaptation of Buddhist, or even let's just say Asian, or even just foreign religious cultural elements. Are there processes that go on widely in many different situations or examples that we could tease out what those processes were by looking specifically at one big case example, the mindfulness movement? So looking at the processes of adaptation in order to begin to develop a larger theory of adaptation of Buddhist elements and even beyond. We could say that yoga and Sufi poetry and Kabbalah and everything, they follow similar patterns in their selective adaptation to American culture.
I like that you're using a lot of evolutionary terms, and I would suggest that we're probably in a phase of punctuated equilibrium, where the rate of change is much more rapid than it has been in the past because of many different factors that weren't in play in the past couple of thousand years, like social networking, modern technology, and the ability to very quickly disseminate ideas instead of being localized and only to a few numbers of people. But we'll get more into that. I wanted to ask another question first around a phrase you put in the title, mutual transformation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, this is really the phase where my research is at this point. Initially, back when I was in graduate school, I was often interested in questions of how does this Asian thing become American? So it was sort of a one-way thing. It takes off from Asia, flies across the ocean, and somehow settles into the U.S. What's going on as that happens? Well, I'm very interested in sort of the two-way street these days, the ways in which American culture at large is changing what it is to be a Buddhist, how Buddhism is understood, how meditation is understood by Buddhists and fellow travelers. So, what effects are American culture having on it? And I'm interested, of course, in the other side of that equation. How is Buddhism, in this case exemplified by the mindfulness movement, how is it not only being subject to the pressures of its environment, how is it, in fact, altering its environment by its presence? This is something I looked at in both of the previous books, but I thought that, hey, this is the big one. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It only shows signs of growing and growing and growing and ever further entrenching itself in various different aspects of North American culture. So let's look at this. So it's about how the fact that this is a non-Buddhist culture means that Buddhist elements are often marketed as not being Buddhist, or people don't have to be Buddhist in order to do them. That's an adaptation to meet a wider audience. So that's an American transformation that occurs to the Buddhism. On the other hand, as the people do in fact take it up, it gets embedded in medical practice, in psychology, in counseling. It's being brought into the schools, both public schools and at universities. There's a lot of mindfulness training which goes on my campus. Not any of it done by official Buddhist groups or Buddhist student groups or anything like that. As we know, it's being brought to the American military, and there's many other places where we see it as well. Certainly, you're aware of the many business applications where CEOs are touting it, and it's being taught, at corporate workshops and this sort of thing. So these are influences that Buddhism is having on the culture around it, and I'm interested in how the culture around it reshapes Buddhism, whether the Buddhists do this consciously or not.
So as you're putting this book together, you're focused on the mindfulness movement, a phrase we've both used many times just in this conversation. You see that as being a bit different than other adaptations, like, for example, in your previous book, Dixie Dharma, is how Dharma is in the South. Do you see this mindfulness movement as a different kind of animal?
Well, some of the processes at work are going to be the same, but they're not all going to be the same because this is a different situation. There, I was looking specifically at temple Buddhism. I did about 10 years worth of ethnography at a temple in Richmond, Virginia, which houses various types of Buddhists, and including an insight meditation group. And I was curious in how being in the South, what effects that had on them. I also looked at some of the effects they had on their local environment. But if anything, certainly the cultural impact on that Buddhism is stronger than the reverse impact of the Buddhists on their local landscape, in my estimation. Well, here we have a different sort of situation because with the mindfulness movement, it's not a single site standing in as a test for other sites potentially, but it's a sort of vast, decentralized, or at least multi-centered, many multi-centered movement, which incorporates a variety of different lineages. But overall, there's a lot of commonality these days around how mindfulness is understood. And I'm very interested in how market forces shape the mindfulness movement. That's something that I've really strongly tried to investigate in this work and probably in future work as well. Because let's face it, we talk about this as a Christian or possibly post-Christian culture. We talk about it as being secular or so on, as being democratic. But one of the very strongest aspects of contemporary American culture is the dominance of the marketplace and marketplace thinking as a source for just our daily metaphors and so on. It shapes our lifestyles. even alternative lifestyles, such as pursuing Buddhism or meditation, are increasingly commodities that are marketed to us through so-called alternative media and so on, which are nonetheless themselves often operating under market pressures. So I'm very interested in this aspect of sort of Buddhism under late modern capitalism and what's going on there, and the transformations that occur, the adaptations that people have to make because they're living in this sort of situation. This leads to such things as the rise of the professional mindfulness instructor, something that did not exist in Asian Buddhist history, but that's become a bona fide career path for not a small number of people, an awful lot of people. But even as that expands, then people have to find ways to market themselves in competition with one another and with all of the others out there also competing for your so-called alternative spirituality buck, right? So why should I patronize this mindfulness teacher? Why should I buy that mindfulness book? There's all these others I might also choose from. Plus, instead, I might be doing some sort of yoga or some sort of tantric practice, or maybe I'll go to the Kabbalah Center, or this or that and everything. How is mindfulness having to compete, and what strategies are taken, therefore, in this sort of situation? This isn't something we've had a lot of attention to in the study of Buddhism in North America. There's been perhaps a queasiness around money issues and so on, but the market is so dominant. We must pay attention to it if we're to understand what's going on around us.
I agree with that. And in fact, it seems to be one of the shared concerns that many of us who came from a traditional background, as we're eager to see things like mindfulness become more socialized widely and accessible to everyone in our culture, not just those who are willing to be Buddhist, there is, of course, a little bit of hesitancy because, as you're stating, we're in a capitalist environment. That is where we come from. That is the hand that we've been dealt. And so, of course, there are different selective pressures on people who teach this, for example. And there is a tendency to shift one's driving motivation from sharing the Dhamma to, okay, so how do we make money on this? And we see this in particular in the mindfulness movement, I think, with things like doing mindfulness programs in corporations. That's one of the things that's asked about most in mindfulness conferences. How do I do that? How do I break into corporate culture and teach mindfulness? And I think there may be a little bit of confusion and perhaps lack of awareness on our own parts as teachers that we're not always necessarily doing this to share the Dharma. We're not always doing it to share mindfulness. Sometimes we're doing it because we see an opportunity for a comfortable income in doing something that we love doing. What are some of your thoughts on that? Is that resonating with what you're seeing in terms of market pressures?
Well, I think we absolutely see that, and we would have to expect that to happen. The truth of the matter is, while I will agree definitely that this situation today is in some ways a unique situation, at the same time, Buddhism has not ever at any point from the very beginning or at any stage of its evolution been apart from economic matters. We have a stereotype of wise, celibate Buddhist masters sitting, quietly in a cave on top of a mountain somewhere, somehow not entangled in economics. This has not ever actually existed. This is some sort of fantasy. From the very beginning, what do we see the Buddha setting up? He's setting up an alternative society, which nonetheless is embedded within the larger economic and political exchanges of its host culture. And he's setting up his sangha as economically dependent upon the laity, and the laity sort of religiously dependent upon the sangha. In other words, this is an economy of exchange whereby people are providing material goods to one set in this transaction, and the other side is providing spiritual goods, such as chanting and so on, to produce merit, which is then provided either to the donor or often to the donor's ancestors or family or something like that. These patterns are not later degradation or something or devolution of Buddhism. We find these patterns right early on in Buddhism, and they continue. In fact, this ability to confer practical benefits that are wanted by the host culture in some way. This is, I want to argue, a theme that runs throughout Buddhist history. And mindfulness these days is unprecedented in some ways. For example, the rise of professional lay meditation teachers who are pursuing this for economic as well as other motivations. This is something we have not had in the past. Also, the widespread access to meditation technology via print, internet, and other sources is very different. It used to be mostly the preserve of monks and their, semi-cloistered environments, this sort of thing, right? Now, if I want mindfulness, I just go to Barnes and Noble. Like, there's no need for me to go and engage with a religious community anymore. These are different. But at the same time, the idea that people are mostly doing mindfulness in order to receive some sort of this worldly, very practical, direct benefit that they'll be able to measure in their own life, that's not that unusual. People have been chanting or doing all sorts of other practices historically in order to get the benefits they wanted. Of course, in previous times, in different cultures, the benefits they sought have not been the same ones we're necessarily seeking in this moment, in this particular culture, because every culture will seek different things. But now we have mindfulness, which is fine-tuned in order to produce greater sexual satisfaction, and mindfulness, which is designed to make us more efficient workers, and mindfulness, which is promoted specifically as a method to deal with the stress which your family, especially your children, create in your life, and so on and so on. Mindfulness was never used for these purposes in the pre-modern Asian past. It was being done almost exclusively by monks and by nuns who didn't have children, didn't have careers, certainly didn't have sex. They weren't using mindfulness in these ways. And yet other aspects of Buddhism were being used to enhance this worldly thing. So we see an old Buddhist technology, mindfulness, applied to an old Buddhist theme, this worldly benefits, but this combination did not exist in previous cultures.
We were talking a little bit about how there's this mutual relationship, this mutual transformation, and that you were seeing a bit less of Buddhists' impact on, say, a Southern culture than we might in, say, somewhere in California, where you might see something a little more impactful in both ways. I'm wondering, Jeff, if there's any relationship that you have found between kind of the cultural ossification of whatever that geographic culture happens to be, if there's some solidness in that versus a more relaxed, open, and receptive kind of culture. Do those tend to adapt Buddhism a little bit more into culture versus those that are fairly set in their ways?
I would have to say that those sort of factors would definitely apply. I can't think for myself of any exact examples that fit either of those models just for myself. But in general, those are good examples of the sort of underlying pre-existing cultural tendencies which may exist in this country versus that country, or in this region versus that region, or so on, even in this sort of metropolitan area versus that one, or versus that rural area or something. Those sort of forces are definitely going to be at play in how Buddhism plays out in whatever, sort of scale of environment we're talking about. I can't think of any exact examples off the top of my head, but I would certainly agree with the general observation.
So do you think the rise of this mindfulness movement was an inevitable result of Buddhism's encounter with modernity, particularly a Western contemporary culture?
Absolutely not. No. There's very little which is inevitable, be it in Buddhism or anywhere else. That said, there's a lot of things that have so many contributing factors that they can feel rather inevitable. But the truth of the matter is that if I was some sort of evil time traveler, let's say that I were the master from the Doctor Who science fiction series, and so I had the ability, I had a machine that could take me through time, and I had the desire to impose my preferred ideas upon others, indeed upon time itself, and was willing to, let's put it politely, eliminate people from the timeline who might otherwise inconvenience me and my plans for world domination. That's right. Yeah, they've been sent upstate to a farm. Yeah, like everybody's dog, right? Or their guppy, which is certainly not down the toilet. So, if I were such a person, and let's say that I had decided that the rise of mindfulness, especially in the West, was the number one impediment to my plans for world domination, and so I wished to prevent it from happening, I think that I would be able to do so with a surprising amount of ease. So these things that are massive and seem inevitable are actually quite historically contingent. What I mean by all this is that if I got in my time machine, went back in time, and perhaps dispatched maybe a dozen or a few dozen individual people, I could prevent the outbreak, such as it is, of mass meditation in this way. I would have to eliminate a certain number of Burmese monks. There's a few people in the mindfulness movement from the West I would have to take care of. You've seen all their names on the shelf. There would be an inconvenient Vietnamese monk who would probably have a date with a destiny that I don't actually wish for him, and so on. And with just a few people out of the way, this mindfulness movement would, number one, look vastly different than it does today, but might likely not even come about at all. Does this mean that there wouldn't, however, be sort of an interest in meditation or, let's say, alternative personal spiritual cultivation techniques? No, probably a lot of that is very deeply embedded in Western culture. If I wanted to get rid of that, I'd have to bump off Emerson. I'd have to drown Thoreau in Walden Pond. All sorts of stuff would have to happen for that bigger effect. But it wouldn't be Buddhist mindfulness. There would be other things that would be going on. We'd all be whirling like dervishes and chanting the names of Allah in our cubicle in order to increase our work productivity and get a raise, this sort of thing. It would be something else would fill that gap instead.
And I appreciate you following up on the Doctor Who references. Thank you very much for that. Always fun to talk about time travel. I'm wondering, Jeff, what are your thoughts about, since that hasn't happened and you don't have a TARDIS, it is here. Mindfulness movement is, at least at this point in time, seemingly fairly powerful in its momentum. And we understand, many of us who are a bit concerned about a backlash from much of the hype, which is also part of mindfulness. And we understand that there will also be not so good teachers along with good teachers. What is your thought around the trajectory of this, and what's in the future for mindfulness and how it relates to Buddhism?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, maybe that's sort of the key question on a great many people's minds right at this moment when it seems like another turning point is occurring. Perhaps a set of turning points where mindfulness is really, really hitting the big time at this point, and its connection to Buddhism is becoming ever more tenuous as people are encountering mindfulness meditation, which is something directly extracted from out of Buddhism, where they're encountering this in non-Buddhist settings, say at the hospital, being taught to them by non-Buddhists, a nurse or a doctor, and they themselves are not Buddhist, the patient or client. They may well be a Christian or agnostic or something else, and they're doing it for non-Buddhist reasons. Gosh, I'm really anxious. I'll just do this mental technique that my psychologist taught me, and I'll calm down and I won't have to pay for as much counseling anymore. I'll just sort of self-medicate with meditation in this way. So this is Buddhism entirely denuded of Buddhism. And this is quite an interesting thing. In some ways, we've already reached that point. So it's hard to imagine where the end game is beyond that. And we already have the idea of it being applied to all these different realms of cultural behavior. I've already talked about sex, parenting, many other things, right? Eating, a very big one these days. Let's face it, Americans are obsessed with food. And so naturally, we have mindful eating movements and this sort of thing. So where it goes from here, well, it really is, it seems to be at a sort of a late stage here, and it's unclear exactly where it goes. Then, of course, anything at all which is large and popular provokes countercurrents and resistance. This is, again, looking at cultural and market forces here. This is entirely predictable. There are the direct stimulants of, for example, bad teachers or bad experiences with meditation or so on may lead people to, become disgruntled and speak out based on those personal experiences. But beyond that, we can just simply predict that these sort of things will happen because anytime something gets big and popular, there's going to be other opinions in the room, particularly in a very diverse, contentious society like the United States, and one which celebrates the right of everyone to be correct in their own opinion. And we have the great ability to push those opinions out into the public sphere these days via our vastly increased communication technologies you alluded to earlier. So we can expect that as mindfulness becomes more embedded in the culture and more diverse and more involved outside of religious Buddhist circles, we will experience a greater adoption of mindfulness and a greater resistance to mindfulness, especially on the part of other religious groups that will mobilize against it. So we see the beginnings of movements to have it prevented from being taught in public schools because of alleged religious connections. These are made sometimes by secular people who do not want religion in the schools, and sometimes made by, for example, conservative Christians who do not want non-Christian material in the school, and so on. So these are essentially opposite constituencies, and yet they both are recruited into an anti-mindfulness movement by their various sort of reactions to this sort of thing. So we will see much more of that, and just a general complexification of the mindfulness ecosystem is what I imagine in the future. Beyond that, what will mindfulness look like 100, 200 years from now? Very difficult to say, because 100 years ago, could we have predicted the internet and Facebook and smartphones and these things? The technologies we'll be using will be so impactful upon our very lifestyles and conceptions of self and of roles in society that it's very difficult to imagine what they will be.
Thank you very much for being here. Our guest today, Jeff Wilson. You can find out more about Jeff on his website, professorjeffwilson.wordpress.com, which I'll be linking on the episode page for this episode. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.